Hi, my name is Dasha, and today I will be talking about transgenerational trauma and resilience in post-communist Central Europe. Experiencing traumatic events can leave significant imprints on people's lives. It can affect not only those who experience the traumatic events, but also those who are raised by the people who experienced them. Sometimes traumatic events happen to a whole country's population and are embedded in the memories shared by that society. These memories can be passed down to generations that come after them as a result of the collective trauma. This article explores the psychological consequences and the lasting effects of state oppression on survivors and their descendants. The article looks at the experience of two generations that experienced state oppression in former Czechoslovakia compared to a control group of families that did not face any type of oppression. The study aims to contribute to the existing knowledge about historical trauma and transgenerational transmission of trauma and resilience in post-totalitarian countries of Eastern and Central Europe. The study specifically focuses on Czechoslovakian people who have not been studied as much as others in previous psychological studies. The study tries to expand on the context through which historical trauma is examined, with the purpose of contributing to our understanding of the dynamics between history and culture and historical trauma and resilience across generations. Central and Eastern European countries endured decades of political oppression under socialist and communist regimes, as well as dependence on the Soviet Union during the last half of the 20th century. Survivors of such trauma struggle with long-term psychological effects such as PTSD and other mental disorders. Families of survivors tend to adopt coping mechanisms and communication styles that can influence psychological well-being and abilities to adapt across generations. Some of these are fear of persecution, generalized distrust, a tendency towards secrecy, concealment, or avoidance of discussing past experiences. The study focuses on people affected by the campaign known as the SNS, meaning sanitation, campaign, coordinated by state security, or the secret police, aiming to deport protesters of the regime and their families from the country in order to prevent them from continuing their anti-regime activities. They wanted to impose long-term pressure that would make living in Czechoslovakia unbearable. This strategy allowed the regime to maintain an appearance of humanism while systematically violating the human rights of its opponents. The tactics employed during the campaign involved psychological and physical abuse like job loss, bans on children's education, intimidation, humiliation, repeated interrogations, provisional detentions, eavesdropping, and rarely also assaults. Based on previous studies, these researchers expected to see higher levels of stress and other trauma-related symptoms in the first and second generations of survivors of state oppression, but also higher resilience levels than the control groups. Researchers tried to find as many surviving families as possible. They were able to find 58 participants and put them in 4 groups. 29 people from the first and second generations matched with 29 control people, also of 2 generations, and they were matched by age group. The control group consists of individuals who shared similar socio-political contexts and backgrounds, with the difference being their lack of experience with political persecution and expulsion. Participants were asked if events related to the SNS group were the most distressing in their lives, and if not, they were asked to write down what in their lives was the most distressing. They used questionnaires asking about severity of stress and trauma-related symptoms, coping mechanisms, resilience levels, and communication. Participants were assessed on the severity of their PTSD symptoms based on the PTSD checklist for DSM-5. They were given a brief COPE 28-item questionnaire to assess the coping responses they developed. They were given a brief resilience scale, which measured their ability to recover from stress, and the family communication scale, measuring satisfaction with positive communication among family members. No significant differences were found between the first-generation survivors and their control group, but the second generation reported the most severe trauma-related symptoms, specifically hyperarousal and the lowest overall resilience among the studied groups. These results suggest high vulnerability of the second generation. Most of the respondents from G1 and G2 did not consider experiences related to the SNS campaign to be the most distressing in their lives. Like the control groups, they often reported other events that were not related to the asinus campaign as the most distressing things they experienced, like interpersonal conflicts, divorce, or bullying. The study found no significant differences between G1 and the corresponding control group, which differs from other studies on the survivors of state oppression, who experienced more severe trauma symptoms, but also showed higher levels of resilience and ability to recover from stress than their control groups. This could be due to lower levels of oppression in Czechoslovakia than other countries at the time, especially with the regime's goal to maintain a righteous and humane appearance, meaning that they only rarely employed tactics that would meet criterion A for PTSD in the DSM-5, experiencing or witnessing actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, either directly or indirectly through close ones. Another reason for these results could be the socio-demographic profile of the Czech population, most of which have high levels of education, which could contribute as a protective factor against trauma. Here we have two tables from the study. Table 3 shows that the second generation reported a higher symptom severity than its control group, a lower ability to recover after stress than the control group and the first generation of survivors, and higher scores in hyperarousal than the first generation and its control group. Table 1 shows demographic characteristics of the 4 study groups. In conclusion, no significant differences between first generation of survivors and control group were found, but a heightened vulnerability to stress and trauma-related symptoms were, as well as lower ability to recover from stress. The researchers expected to see higher levels of stress and other trauma-related symptoms in the first and second generations of survivors of state oppression and higher resilience levels, but instead found that they were not as affected by it as people in other countries were, and discussed possible reasons why. As we've learned in class, adversity does not equal trauma. Adversity is an event, and trauma is a response to that event, but not everyone that experiences adversity becomes traumatized by it. This study perfectly exemplifies that by producing results that are different from other studies conducted on survivors of state oppression in other countries. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope everyone has a great day.